Linda, and I'm a healer and a coach. And in this channel, we talk about healing and emotional intelligence subjects and how you can use them in the day-to-day to live a more fulfilling and abundant life. Today, I want to talk about the subject of communication, but more specifically, I want to talk about communication during conflict or within the context of conflict. So we're going to talk a little bit in general terms about communication and conflict, and then I'm going to give you some tips of how you can navigate some of these things in your day-to-day with some real-life examples, and also how we can apply them to create the life that we want for ourselves. So first, I think it's important that we all recognize, or that I establish, that conflict is a part of life, right? A part of being human is that there's going to be frequently there's going to be times where our needs, our desires, our expectations are going to be different than the people around us. And therefore, conflict is really not something that we can avoid. So knowing that, what is important to recognize is that there will always, for the most part, be conflict in our lives. It is really how we approach it and how we navigate it that is really what's more important. And one of the things that I recently found is that our fear of conflict, yes, sometimes we have a fear of confrontation and how to handle it and what to say, but our fear of conflict is more based on our fear about what that means for us, what conflict means for us, and what it means for our relationship with the other person or the people around us. So I think it's really important to recognize that we cannot control the other person's reactions, and that even sometimes when we do everything right, the reaction that we get or the result may not be the most amicable one. So I think one of the things that is very important to remember is to try and practice a stance or a position of non-attachment. And I want to be very clear, I don't mean detachment, I mean non-attachment, and they're very different. What I mean is sort of use these tips and these techniques from the perspective of, you want to stand in your own integrity and approach them in integrity. And it's okay to want, we all want the result to be amicable and to be good for both parties, or more accurately, we want it to be good for ourselves. But we need to understand that that's not always the case, and that these tips and techniques that I'm talking about here are about how you can approach the situations in a way that feels better for you, that is more in integrity with you and the person you're developing yourself to be. It isn't really about the outcome or the result. I hope that's clear. But with that, why don't we just get into some of the tips? And I'm sorry, there's a beeping noise. I don't know if you guys can hear it. It was driving me crazy earlier, but I think my neighbor's fire alarm, the battery is dead, and it's making that really weird beeping sound. So if you hear it, please disregard it. That's what it is. So I can't do anything about it. So the first tip that I want to talk about is about getting clear about how you're feeling and why. And this is really important. And for those of you who've seen some of my previous videos, this is something that I talk about. I do have a video specifically about emotions and feelings, but it is something that I talk about throughout a lot of my videos because it's one of the most important things in our development journey, is understanding what your emotions are and why you're feeling them, and then making choices and acting in accordance to that, right? In alignment with that, because I think it's really important, a really important piece, because it tells us what our motivations are. When we know what our emotion is and why we're feeling it, it usually opens up a clear path to what is motivating our behavior. So this is a really important step in any situation where there's conflict. I I think it may be a little bit more difficult in situations of professional conflict, because what is important to remember is that sometimes getting clear on your emotions and why they're there is not always a very easy or fast thing, right? Sometimes it can take us hours, days, sometimes weeks to process why we feel a certain way, why we're experiencing a certain emotion. And sometimes it takes us just as long to even identify what the emotion is. So I understand that. I think what I will say for now is that the more you do it, the more you practice this, the easier it becomes, and the faster you are at identifying what the emotion is that you're experiencing and why. But it is very important that we get clear. Now, in personal situations, whether it's with a romantic partner, a family member, a friend, we often have the benefit that we can say, you know what, I'm actually really triggered, or I'm actually feeling very angry, or we have the situation of conflict right now, whatever the case may be, and I'm going to need to take some time to process my emotions, or to process my perspective, my experience, my thoughts about this. So a lot of times it is a lot easier to do it in that sort of situation, and I do want to encourage you to do that when you can. If you are having a situation of conflict with someone, and you're not clear about what the emotions are that you're feeling or why, I will really strongly encourage you to use that, to ask the person for some time to process that information before you engage in further communication, because that actually is going to be very helpful. In professional situations where that's not always available, or it's not something that we can always do, it is important that we try to do it where we can. If you have, I have a couple of friends at work where we have a pretty personal relationship, so when situations of conflict arise with them in particular, we have that level of closeness where I can say, you know what, this doesn't sit right with me, or I'm feeling angry about this decision, or I'm feeling like this is not the right choice, or whatever, so I just need a little bit of time to process it. So there's times where you can do that, and it varies greatly, and it depends on what your work experience, your professional situation is. But there's going to be times where you cannot do that. What I would also encourage you to do is that even if you have to try and resolve the conflict at that time, or even if you have to engage in communication at that time, because you don't have the benefit of taking a step back and doing it separately, even after that has been processed, that work situation has been resolved or completed, go back to it after the fact on your own to try and decipher what were your emotions and why you were feeling those emotions. Because that's still information, right? That's data that you can use in the future for other situations. And like I said before, the more you do this, the easier it becomes. So the second tip, which is actually tied to the first one, is to also question the assumptions you are making about the other person and their motivations. And that is something that we fall into a lot. And it's very common, a lot more common in our personal, I think it is a lot more common anyways, in our personal relationships. And I think an example that I can give is if you're in a romantic partnership and you live with your partner, be it your husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever your label is for it, and that person, consistently doesn't put the dishes in the dishwasher, and you've asked them a million times and they keep not putting them in the dishwasher. What most of us, and I'll speak for myself in the past, when this happens, you immediately assume that the reason why they're not doing it is just to annoy you or to bother you or because they don't listen to you, right? And I understand that's a very human reaction, but the truth is that more often than not, that is actually not the truth. They're doing it because of their own issues, because they're either forgetful or they don't think it's important or whatever the case may be. But we are immediately assuming that they are doing it because they want to hurt us or because they're choosing to make us angry. And I think it's really important to question those. And when you have a relationship where you can question those things together is even better. But it's very important to question those because that can actually help give you a different perspective on the situation. So number 3 is to determine what it is that you want out of you want to get out of this conflict. I think the immediate answer that jumps to mind is that everybody just wants an amicable resolution, right? Or when you're in a situation of conflict, what you want is a resolution. What I find is that that is actually not always true. And there's someone I watch online who mentioned recently that oftentimes people want victory. They want to win. And that really resonated with me for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is because I used to be that person, right? I was in situations where it was really important for me to be right. And I still love to be right, but I don't prioritize that now over other things. I think peace, resolution, love, connection is more important to me than being right. I mean, if I end up being right, it's absolutely an added bonus. But in any case, I think what I want to convey here is that it's important that we have an awareness of why it is that we are engaging in this conflict. Especially when it comes to professional situations, what I've found is that a lot of times two people are coming in at it from different angles and there is a conflict, but the outcome that we're both looking for may be the same, right? Both people may want their client to be successful or to give the client the best customer service possible, but we are coming at it from different angles. And it's very important when you know what it is that you're trying to get, it actually informs a lot of the tools that you use to navigate that conflict, right? Because it's very different when you are engaged in a discussion with someone, and I'm speaking specifically in a professional situation, where you're trying to get to something and you both have very different opinions and it's turning a little bit heated. It's very different when you understand that what you both want is to do the best you can for the customer versus when you know that what you want is you want to be right and you want to win over that person because that's a coworker that you don't like or someone that did something to you, whatever. That actually informs how you move forward, because I would like to assume that in most situations what we want is a resolution that is harmonious and good for everybody. And once you're able to identify that, it makes it easier for you to take a step back and really take a look at what is happening from different perspectives. So the next thing that I want to talk about, or the next tip, I think is tip number 4, is about using I feel statements. And this is something that most people probably have heard about. I actually heard about it for the first time before I started this journey, maybe close to 20 years ago on an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which, by the way, is one of my favorite shows. But in any case, and is using I feel statements. And what that means is that, I think most of you would know, but I'm just, for those of you who don't, I'll just talk about it for a minute, is when you're in a situation of conflict and you're actually engaging in a discussion with someone, we have this tendency to blame the other person for our emotions or for our experience. So we'll basically say, oh, you're inconsiderate, or you did this, I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling hurt because you did X, Y, or Z. So when we do that, we're immediately putting the other person in a defensive position, right? Because it feels, when someone's blaming you for something, you immediately feel attacked and you go into defensive mode. That's just human, is actually an animal instinct. It's very primal. So when you reframe that and you approach the situation from the perspective where you tell the other person, I felt hurt, or when you say, I think it's important, or it's better when you start with the I feel, is to, I feel hurt when you say X, Y, or Z, or I feel angry when you did X, Y, or Z because blah, 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 blah. And what that does is it actually puts the responsibility of the emotion on you. Now, the behavior still may have to trigger that, but it is really helpful because you're expressing how you feel, what the emotion is that you're experiencing, while at the same time not blaming or attacking the other person. And I actually had a recent situation with a friend of mine where we had a very difficult conversation that was a long time coming, and I think it ended up in a very positive way for both of us, and I think, or as positive as that type of situation can be. And part of the reason is because I really made a very conscious effort to focus my description of my experience in terms of how I felt or what the emotions were that I was experiencing at a particular time or during a particular behavior. Because at the end of the day, I don't think most people do things to try and hurt others. And I generally do believe that. I mean, there's days where I question it, but in general, I do believe that. So I think it's important that when we are engaging in communication in an environment of conflict or a situation where there's conflict, that we approach it from the perspective of, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z, and this is why. So the next tip is actually tied to that. It is about expressing honestly without attacking or blaming, which we sort of talked about just a minute ago. But the one thing that I want to add, and the reason why I wanted to separate those two, is because of the piece of expressing honestly. And I think for those of you who are familiar with Brené Brown, she has an amazing TED Talk about vulnerability. And I think the importance of expressing honestly is that it allows yourself to be vulnerable, and it allows the other person, it makes room for the other person to also open up as well. And the more honest you are, the better, because the more in integrity you are. So I think that's a really important piece, and it's going to tie into another tip that I have further down. So I'll just put a pin holder on that for a moment. The other thing is to also be honest about your motivations and your expectations. And I don't necessarily mean that you have to be honest with the other person, though that would be great if you feel comfortable doing that. But what is more important here is that you are honest with yourself about what your motivation and your expectation is for the conflict resolution. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times we want to resolve something just because we don't want to be in conflict anymore, right? Because we're uncomfortable being in conflict, or because we want to find the resolution, we want to get to the resolution that we want rather than a resolution that is harmonious for everybody. So I think it's really important, because when you're aware of what your motivation is and what your expectation is, it makes it a lot easier for you to navigate this types of situations. It's sort of akin to, you can drive using your GPS or satellite sat nav, I think is what they use in Europe, your GPS sat nav. If you don't have the address, if you don't know where you're going, how can you figure out how to get there? And that is really why this is important. It's really important to understand what your motivation and expectation is for this resolution. And the other thing is, and this is the one that ties back to being honest, is to apologize if appropriate. And the reason why I phrase that way is our social media culture, this new cancel culture thing that has come up over the last, I don't know, maybe a couple of years, but is very prevalent now, really puts a lot of people in situations where they are forced to make an apology. And this is more, we see it more with celebrities and people, that are very prominent, that they say something and then everybody flips their lid about something they said, and next thing they know, they're being basically forced to apologize. And may not be physically forced, but in order to calm things down and for it not to affect the sales of the new movie or the TV show, whatever, they need to apologize. And I think that is really important, that when we apologize, we do it from a genuine place for a variety of reasons, but more importantly is because when you're apologizing and you don't mean it, everybody knows. Like, you don't have to be a spiritual, in the spiritual journey, you don't have to be an intuitive or a psychic or anything like that to understand, to feel when someone is not being genuine about their apology. We know that, we can see that, we can feel that. So for me personally, and what I would like to encourage in others is that it's very important that we apologize because we think it's the right thing to do, because it is important for us to do, because we recognize that we did something hurtful. And I think that's, again, I'm sorry, I'm hearing the beeping again, so it just distracted me. But in any case, it's important that we do it generally. And this ties in to the next piece, or the next tip, which would be tip number 8, and is to allow the person to talk and express their perspective without interrupting them and without invalidating them. Now, it's okay to ask questions, and a lot of times we do need to do that. But the reason why I express it, and this is a really, really important one, we have this tendency in general, but especially in the Latin culture, I found that this is even more prevalent. We have this tendency to invalidate another person's experience. And we don't do it on purpose. We don't oftentimes don't even know that we are doing it. But it's really, really important that when we are communicating in situations of conflict, we are actually allowing that person to express their perspective, their emotions, their experience without, again, interrupting, but more importantly, without invalidating them. And one example that I can give you that is a fairly innocuous example is, when you have a little boy that is running and he falls down and, hurts his knee and starts crying, right? What I find that most people do is they come running to him and they're like, oh, don't worry, that wasn't anything. There's nothing to cry about. It's okay, it's okay. And I understand the motivation of doing that is to try and ease the pain, have that child not focus on the pain, right? But that actually is a pretty simple example of how we are invalidating someone's experience and how we teach that from a very young age, because the little boy actually fell down, hurt his knee, which is actually painful. He may even be bleeding or scrape his knee or whatever the case may be. That actually physically hurts. So telling him that it's okay, that nothing happened, not to cry, not to worry about it, is actually invalidating, because that's not the truth and that's not his experience in that moment. So I think it's very important for us in our society in general that we remember that and that we continue to practice that. This idea of communicating with others without invalidating their experience. Just because their experience is not the same as yours, or because you don't see or understand their experience, does not mean that it's not valid. Now, the other thing is that, and I think this ties a little bit to the idea of, be honest about your motivations and your expectations, is also that it's important for you to understand and express your boundaries. And I do have another video about boundaries, so you can go into that if you want. Sorry, all, the battery died. I feel like I say this in a lot of videos. I think there's an issue with the battery. But anyways, so I think, we were on the next tip, which is decide how you want to move forward. And the reason why that is important is because this may not be as common necessarily in professional relationships, particularly because, like I said before, in professional relationships is easy, or conflict is easy. Oftentimes it's easier to know what the outcome is that you're going towards. And you also have other people like, managers, bosses that help drive that as well. But when it comes to personal relationships, whether it's family, friends, partners, whatever, deciding how to move forward is a little bit trickier. And the reason is because sometimes moving forward and sometimes a resolution to a conflict is just that both people need to go their separate ways. And I know that that's not what most people think of as resolution or what most people want, but in truth is sometimes what is best. So I think it's really important that through this communication, through this process of communicating in conflict, we we understand that resolution doesn't always mean, we're going to come back together and everything is going to be great. Sometimes resolution means we need to separate, sometimes for a long time or a little time, sometimes forever. And sometimes it means we need to still work on this, we need to negotiate, or whatever the case may be, whatever that looks like for you and this other person or persons. It's important that we recognize that resolution comes in a lot of different ways and flavors. And the last thing that I want to mention is that we need to remember that it's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect, right? Our navigating this is not going to be perfect. Now, I've been in this, self-development journey, spiritual journey for quite a few years now. I think it's going to be close to a decade. I don't remember either. Yeah, next year is going to be a decade where I've been actively, working on healing, developing my skills, my spiritual journey, etc. And I still struggle with this, right? Because there's a lot of different situations, a lot of different scenarios that come up. And the good news is that the more you do it, the easier it becomes, the faster it is for you to recognize which emotions you are feeling, the easier it is for you to continue to navigate it. But the truth is that I still get nervous. That the conversation that I was talking about earlier that I recently had with a friend of mine, I was actually really nervous before that conversation started, and I actually had to write down all of my thoughts and feelings and emotions and how I wanted to approach it, how I wanted to open the conversation and how I wanted to approach it, just so that I could get a clearer sense of how that was going to go, just because, or how I wanted that to go. And one of the things that helped me do was identify what I wanted the outcome of this to be, or what my expectations were. And it was a really good exercise for me, and something that I suggest that people try it. That's actually another tip that I wasn't intending to include here, but it really was a good tip. It's a good tip because it really was helpful for me to put everything down on paper and understand what is it that I was trying to express and what my expectations were, and then frame the conversation around that. And again, it was super helpful. So I do think it's really important that we remember, that it's not going to be perfect. I was super nervous when I did it, or right before I did it, and luckily the conversation went really well, but that's not always the case, right? And we need to, I think it's really important for us to recognize that, that it's not, even when you do everything right, you may not come to an amicable resolution, right? So it's really important that we try to practice a stance of non-attachment. And I want to be very clear that I do not mean detachment. I mean non-attachment, meaning to come at it from a neutral position, not a position where, I'm distancing myself from this person or this situation so I don't get really emotional. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about non-attachment, meaning be clear in your integrity about what your expectation is and how you're going to frame this, and understand that it may go really well, it may not go well at all, or it may go anywhere in the middle. So that's pretty much all the tips I had for today, because I want to try and keep this video as short as possible. But I did want to mention that it's really important for us to develop the skills because they help us be authentic and be in integrity with who we are, right? Because we are expressing our genuine emotions, we are expressing our boundaries and our interest and desire to be in connection with someone else in a way that feels authentic and harmonious and is a win-win situation, or as close to that as possible for all parties. So practicing the skills helps you develop them, and it actually helps you develop your self-worth and self-love and self-value, because you're approaching life and your relationships from a very authentic place and a place of integrity. And I think, again, like I've said it a few times, it's very important to remember that the more you do it, the easier it becomes. But the one thing that I want to close with is that also the more you do it and the easier it becomes, the more your energetic shifts to align with that. So not only that these types of situations of conflict are going to become easier for you to navigate in the future, is that your energetic stance is going to continue to shift to a place where you're going to be attracting less and less of these types of situations because your energetic about them is shifting. And for those of you who are familiar with the law of attraction, I do have another video about it on the channel, but that is the way the law of attraction works, right? Your energetic attracts these types of situations into your life. So the more you're able to shift those, not only is it better skills for communicating and connecting with the people around you, but the less likely you are to attract these types of situations. So I hope that this was very helpful to you. As usual, feel free to share your comments, your perspective, your questions. And if you want to know more about me, about my work, about my services, again, I'll put my website in the description box below and you can get that information there. And I hope that this was really helpful and enjoyable for you. And as always, until next time. Namaste.